All right, so we are still watching live the trial of South Carolina versus Tammy Moore, and I'd like to introduce our special guest this afternoon who's joined us before here on Law and Crime. Andell Brown, we are happy to have you with us today. Thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Always great to be here.
Well, I'll tell you, there's some interesting pieces of this case that I'd love to discuss for those who are viewing today, and that is, let's talk about first, Tammy Moore and her husband Sidney had previously been charged with murder in this particular case, and those murder charges went away, and now Tammy Moore is facing the kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap charges. So why, can you share with the viewers, would the murder charge go away in this particular case, in your opinion?
Well, I think the prosecution realized that that was not their strongest charge, especially since they don't specifically have where the body is or what exactly happened to Miss Elvis.
All right. Thank you. So we're going to come back to that conversation with a few more questions after we come back from this break. Please stick around. Welcome back to Law and Crime, and now I'm going to turn us to one of my favorite episodes, and that are the top crime stories of the day.
And heads back to her.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country. A Mexican police officer was arrested in Southern California after authorities discovered 50 pounds of methamphetamine during a search of his car. 41-year-old Miguel Patron of Ensenada was stopped by deputies for vehicle code violations, and a canine narcotics officer located a hidden compartment with the drugs. Patron was arrested and now faces drug charges. A limousine service operator was charged with criminally negligent homicide in a limo crash that killed 20 people in New York. 28-year-old Nauman Hussein, a service operator for Prestige Limousine, is accused of hiring driver Scott Licinia Chia, who didn't have a proper license to operate the 19-seat vehicle. The limo reportedly ran a stop sign and plowed into a parked SUV at the bottom of a long hill in the town of Amsterdam, killing all 18 people in the limo and 2 pedestrians. Hussein was released after posting $150,000 bail. A man in Georgia live-streamed a now-viral video of an encounter he had with police after a female Walmart shopper called the cops on him for reportedly being a black man with 2 white children in his car. 27-year-old Corey Lewis, the owner and operator of a youth center called Inspired by Lewis, was at a Walmart babysitting 2 white children he mentors when the unidentified woman allegedly questioned him.
It's 2018, and this is what I got to deal with. She is harassing me because I have 2 kids that do not look like me.
I'm not doing anything. I'm not.
Right.
No, it's just a call we get. All right?
That's ridiculous.
It is what it is.
Right.
It's ridiculous. You tell her go chase some murderers.
Lewis said he wouldn't let this experience stop him from working with kids. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
So I'm going to bring Andell Brown back in to talk about that last story, because I have to be honest, 2018, and I don't notice what color somebody's skin is, and I'd like to think in a perfect world other people don't pay attention to that anymore, but we all know from what we see in the news that that's not true. People do pay attention. Andell, do you think that this was racial profiling and the only reason the woman called the police was because he was black and the 2 kids were white?
Well, I have to be honest, I've yet to hear another reason being given for the call to the police. I don't recall any testimony about there being any threat to the children or anything out of the ordinary except the fact that he was black and the children were white. Until we get any further information, I think that's the only logical conclusion.
And it makes me sad, very sad, and hopeful that someday this will no longer be such an issue. Having said that, one of the things I wanted to point out, though, is it was the police were doing their job. They received a call. But Corey Lewis was very appropriate and responsive and reasonable with law enforcement. So you have to commend him for that. And wow, after being called, the police being called on him, it's a real tribute to him that he handled it with as much poise as he did. So what I'd like to do is turn us back now to the coverage of the trial, and that is South Carolina versus Tammy Moore. And let's talk a little bit about the testimony that we just heard live. And this was from the neighbor who had surveillance tape. And Andell, I'd love to pick your brain. Why was the defense talking about the differences between pictures of her home and specifically all the the bushes and trees around her home from 2018 versus 2013, 5 years ago when the incident occurred. What's the significance? Who cares if the bushes have grown or not, or what they look like in the pictures?
Well, I think what the defense is doing here is trying to poke holes in her credibility, or not only her credibility, but her ability to have observed what she says she observed, when she observed it, and to retain that information over the course of 5 years. Obviously, things have changed, bushes grow, et cetera, and they want to show that she could not have remembered everything exactly as it was 5 years ago, and she may be well-intentioned, but she also may be mistaken.
So the prosecution came back and, in my opinion, did a really artful job of doing exactly what they're supposed to do on redirect, and that is rehabilitated their own witness and went through each point the defense had raised. And so the first point that prosecution raised was, okay, so the bushes may or may not have grown very much. Is the house in the same place that it was? Did this happen in the same way that you said it did? Do you think the prosecution has done an effective job of kind of rehabilitating or taking out of question her credibility for the jury in this case?
I think they did a great job of bringing back the focus on the main thing, which is that the house hasn't moved, it's the same place, and that this witness is doing her best, and she's giving an accurate description from her perspective.
And so what's next? Does the defense typically, and let's just talk basic trial skills, if you're the defense, you ask cross-examination to raise all the doubt that you need to do on behalf of your client, and then the prosecution stands up to say, okay, I'm going to rehabilitate. Would you bother standing up and asking any more questions for those of us who aren't as familiar with trial skills, or would you not ask anything else?
Well, it all depends on what has come out. One of the things you never want to be in trial is repetitive. If you've asked a question, if you've got an answer, if you've made a point, you take it and move on. Cross-examination is not the place where you get to explain and lay out everything. You do what you have to do. When it comes to closing argument, you take the things that you've gotten out of the cross-examination, you put it all together for the jury, and you explain it in a way that's best for your perspective and your client.
All right, so at this point, we are going to go ahead and return to a clip, and this is of another witness in this case in South Carolina. It's the the intelligence analyst that was testifying, and it is Aaron Edens. We're going to return to that now to watch some of that testimony. They are in a 15-minute break during the trial, and that's why we're going to watch some of this testimony until they return to trial. Boy, well, this neighbor certainly is providing testimony about exactly how and why she had surveillance tapes, how those worked. And it's interesting to note, and Andell, I'm going to ask you about this, that she says she heard about it on a Facebook feed. And so then she did a little research, she Googled it, and she figured out it was actually right down the street so she could provide this evidence. Isn't this any prosecution's dream, that the criminal investigation includes people who happen to hear about it and say, wait, I have evidence, and here it is?
Absolutely, it's a prosecution's dream, and it's also a testament to the new era that we are in, where social media provides a lot of evidence that we're seeing more and more in criminal cases, whether it's from the defendant's own accounts on social media or what other people see and decide to supplement the prosecution with their own information or evidence.
Excellent point. We are going to take a break. Please stay with us, and when we come back, we'll return to the trial of South Carolina versus Tammy Moore. Well, I think a part of his testimony that can resonate with all of us is most people don't know what a payphone is anymore because they really aren't available in many places. So let's talk. Andell Brown, our special guest, I'd like to bring you back in to talk about this specific testimony from the officer during the investigation. Here's what's interesting to me. He stated that they got the phone records. There were a number of outgoing calls. We saw he testified as to how long the calls lasted and the numbers they were made to. Then the next step was to send someone to the gas station to find out if they had surveillance tapes, etc. Where's the part of the testimony that explains how they knew who was making those phone calls from the payphone?
Well, you know, that's a tough one, and I'm sure the defense will seize on that the first opportunity they get. And I believe what the prosecution is doing, or what the investigators were doing at that time, was working backwards from the from the person who was being called and saying Elvis must have been making those calls because they were to Sydney Moore, who she had a relationship with and who the prosecution is alleging lured her to that location.
And so as a defense attorney, what would your argument be about the fact that regardless of this investigation, likely they're not going to be able to find out what was said, right? I don't think there's going to be a record that has the conversation because obviously on a payphone it wouldn't have been recorded in this circumstance. So how important is it, or how much can the defense use the fact that they're not going to know what she said, I expect, on this phone call?
Well, when we look at this case as a whole, as a defense lawyer, I would simply be arguing that the prosecution is trying to use coincidence in the place of evidence. They don't seem to have the evidence that they need for conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, so they're trying to use coincidences like a call here, a call there, some other facts that aren't directly associated with what they're saying happened.
We're going to come right back to that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we're going to take a break. Please don't go anywhere and come back to join us after this break. It is always fun to see what kind of crimes are going on around our nation. So now we're going to go to the top crime stories.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on Law&Crime.com and across the country. A Mexican police officer was arrested in Southern California after authorities discovered 50 pounds of methamphetamine during a search of his car. 41-year-old Miguel Patron of Ensenada was stopped by deputies for vehicle code violations, and a K-9 narcotics officer located a hidden compartment with the drugs. Patron was arrested and now faces drug charges. A limousine service operator was charged with criminally negligent homicide in a limo crash that killed 20 people in New York. 28-year-old Nauman Hussein, a service operator for Prestige Limousine, is accused of hiring driver Scott Licinia Chia, who didn't have a proper license to operate the 19-seat vehicle. The limo reportedly ran a stop sign and plowed into a parked SUV at the bottom of a long hill in the town of Amsterdam, killing all 18 people in the limo and 2 pedestrians. Hussein was released after posting a $150,000 bail. A man in Georgia live-streamed a now-viral video of an encounter he had with police after a female Walmart shopper called the cops on him for reportedly being a black man with 2 white children in his car. 27-year-old Corey Lewis, the owner and operator of a youth center called Inspired by Lewis, was at a Walmart babysitting 2 white children he mentors when the unidentified woman allegedly questioned him.
It's 2018, and this is what I got to deal with. She's harassing me because I have 2 kids that do not look like me.
I'm not doing anything. I'm not.
Right.
No, it's just a call we get. All right?
That's ridiculous.
It is what it is.
Right.
It's ridiculous. You tell her
y'all good?
go chase some murderers.
Lewis said he wouldn't let this experience stop him from working with kids. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
Well, that last story with Corey Lewis disturbs me on lots of different levels. I'm from Atlanta, so welcome to another story from Georgia that we've covered. Bob covered one that was somebody being dragged on a car. Now we have this apparent racism rampant. So let me ask you, Andell, let's just play devil's advocate in this case. Is there any reason anyone should have reported this man because he had 2 children that didn't look like him, that perhaps shouldn't have been with him?
Well, I think there has to be more than someone just thinks that they shouldn't have been with him. That's a judgment that can be made on nothing more than what they look like and that their skin color is different from his. I haven't heard anything about any behavior that was exhibited that was strange. So that tends to play into the larger issue we have of people making judgments about others because they look different from them. And that's just flat out wrong.
It is. And so I have to get on my soapbox. I serve as a juvenile court judge pro tem. I'm honored to do so. But one of the things, I never want someone to not report a crime or a belief of a child being abused or neglected. But would you agree with me that from what we've heard about this case, there was no abuse or neglect at all occurring that needed to be reported?
Absolutely. I don't think anyone wants to overlook an issue where a child can be in trouble. But at the same time, we don't want to use law enforcement to operate based on people's assumptions, fears, or prejudices.
Right. And one of the other things I want to just point out is law enforcement has a responsibility when someone reports a crime or what they perceive or think is a crime to investigate. And so I don't think that law enforcement was at all operating outside of what they needed to do in their policies. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would totally agree. They're doing the right thing. But the problem is the more we have these types of events, the less resources, and law enforcement is already stretched thin, they have to dedicate to other serious and dangerous crimes that are going on when cops are being called because a kid is selling water or because the kids that are being babysat don't look like the babysitter or whatever reason we're coming up with today.
Absolutely. And you know, the opposite side of that is there's so many cases I could tell you about and that we all have heard about in the news where someone doesn't report an egregious, horrific case of beating or burning or physically injuring a child. And here you have someone reporting because apparently, allegedly, we haven't heard anything to say otherwise, 2 white children are with a black man. You know, I have to hope going forward these kinds of reports stop and the racism that we see ends. So on that note, we're going to return to the trial of South Carolina versus Tammy Moore. And again, this is where she's been charged with kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnap. The victim, Elvis is the last name, who was disappeared. She just hadn't been seen again since December of 2013, 5 years ago. A body's not been found. She's not been found alive. We hope she is, but nobody knows. We're going to return to pre-recorded testimony, and this is of Officer Jonathan Martin, who investigated this crime and is walking through the specific steps of what he had to do in this investigation. Now, so our viewers know, the reason we're not going back to live trial coverage is because the jury took a 15-minute break, and as often happens in court, I can tell you as a judge on the bench that sometimes 15 minutes lasts a lot longer than that. So we're going to join the pre-recorded testimony, but we will go back live once they resume trial. So Officer Martin is testifying as to his investigation around the kidnapping of the victim in this case. And it's fascinating to me because I feel like all of his questions are about assumptions and asking him to speculate. So I want to bring in my special guest, Attorney Andell Brown. Let's talk about how can the defense get away with asking him to assume? Well, wouldn't you assume a short call means somebody's just saying hello? And wouldn't you assume a long call means they're having a longer conversation? How is that acceptable versus asking them to speculate, which is not allowed?
Well, I think the difference is these questions the defense are asking, they can be reasonably taken from the facts. As for instance, when he said, you know, how do you know there weren't calls going out to another number? Well, they don't know because they didn't have records of the calls going out. They had records of calls going in. And so I think the questions they're asking, they're reasonable from the evidence that's in front of the court.
And how do you feel like this witness is doing? I think he's getting a little combative, a little frustrated with the defense's questions. But what's your perception of that?
Well, I think it looks like the defense is doing a good job of really casting doubt on the strength of that witness's testimony, and he probably doesn't like it. He's an authority figure. Authority figures don't like to be questioned, and that's exactly what this defense attorney's doing.
And do you think it's an effective tool for the jury to hear the defense attorney do that to create reasonable doubt in their minds?
Absolutely. It tells the jury that the prosecution and their witnesses, they may not know as much as they think that they know. They may not have answered all the questions that are here. And in the end, the prosecution has the burden and the duty to answer all the questions, or else it's not guilty.
So it's going to be interesting to see what the jury does in this case. I really don't know what I think is going to happen because of the lack of a body, the lack of knowledge of where this person is and what happened to her. So we are going to take a break. I hope that you will stay with us and come back after break to join us with the rest of the trial in South Carolina versus Tammy Moore. All right, we are listening to testimony from the investigator who was investigating the case of the disappearance of Heather Elvis and I'm looking at the date of December 18th, 2013 is when she disappeared. So Andell Brown, our analyst with us as a criminal defense attorney, one of the things that our viewers noticed on our feed was they felt like the defense objects too much and is just objecting in order to be heard objecting. How do you think that if a viewer thinks that, if the jury thinks that, what does that do to the jury in terms of what's going on their minds and what they want to do in terms of a conviction or not?
Well, I think it just looks like a turnoff. You know, jurors hate to have their time wasted. They're away from their homes, their families, their businesses. They take it very seriously to do the business of justice and their service to the public, but they don't want lawyers wasting their time objecting. It seems as if you're trying to hide something. They just want the truth to come out. If you have a real objection, make it. If not, it's probably best to sit down and focus on your case.
Do you think that juries find it tedious to listen to and go through all of the pieces about the phone records and how they're subpoenaed and how they get them and the surveillance tape and how the surveillance tape is made and how long it's kept? All of those details that are so imperative. Is the jury going to be on the edge of their seats listening to that, or are they going to be struggling to keep up with that?
They will be trying to stay awake more than likely as they hear all of these details. As important as they may be, they're not the most exciting and sexy facts.
Right, right. Good points all. So we are going to return. Like I said, the jury is on a break and should be coming back into the courtroom. When they do, we'll be joining that live. What we've found out and learned is that they are apparently in chambers with the judge. The attorneys were. We don't know why or what they were discussing, but certainly as soon as we know that information, we're going to pass that information back to you. Now we are going to return to some other testimony that was recorded earlier, and that is from the intelligence analyst, Erin Edens, is that witness's name. So let's listen to her testimony. So this is testimony that we're listening to from Erin Edens, the intelligence analyst. And, you know, frankly, it can sound a little dry because the reality is of his job, he's talking about cell phone towers and pings and all of the intricacies of the technology. So I want to bring back in Andell Brown, our attorney with us today. Tell me about, for these jurors listening, what do they do if there's dry testimony? And it's necessary, again, because it shows where the cell tower is, where the phone's pinged off is. It puts all of the video and surveillance and cell phone records together to make sense of it. How does that affect a jury, and is there any way to make it so it's not dry, so to speak?
Well, you have to lay a foundation in a criminal case. You can't introduce evidence or you can't establish a fact without laying a proper foundation, and that's what they're doing. And the jurors, in my opinion and in my experience, they're very conscientious about what they're doing and the job that they have of, you know, finding the fact. A lot of them, they take very studious and copious notes about what's going on in the court. And even though it might seem dry and uninteresting, they're paying attention.
And so now let's turn talk about paying attention. Let's turn our attention to the witness who's on the stand that we've been hearing about, and that he is the phone sex partner, allegedly, and I'm sure he's testifying as to that, of the defendant, Tammy Moore. What's the point of that, or how can the prosecution or defense use that to their advantage?
Well, I'm not exactly sure where they're going with it, but it seems like they're trying to establish a phone number that has been used by Tammy Moore and some of her phone habits that this witness could testify about to either establish or to, you know, diminish a certain fact in the case.
And do you think it'll be effective if I guess establishing a phone number, how much do they need to bring in the fact that it was a sexual relationship via phone versus it was just somebody she talked to on the phone with?
Well, I'm not sure. I think the defense wants to get in the open marriage thing to kind of say that, you know, there's no motive for Tammy to go after Elvis, et cetera, et cetera. They had an open marriage. These things were understood. She would not have been particularly angry or upset by learning that her husband was having an affair with this young woman.
There we go. I think you've just hit the nail on the head. That's what I think, too, is that they really are trying to use this information to take away the motive and say, hey, they were both doing their thing and it was okay with us and there was no motivation to actually go after this victim. And how important is it from a defense perspective that no one knows where the victim is? We don't know if she's deceased, if she's hopefully alive somewhere. Nobody knows that information. At least we haven't heard yet that anyone has that information. What do you do? What's your best play with that as a defense attorney in this case?
Well, I think as a defense attorney, when there's a fact that isn't known, that always goes in your benefit because the state has a burden of proving the facts. Here, we don't know where she went. She could have moved out of town. She could have gone away with someone else. And it appears from the defense perspective that they're saying, look, the prosecution, they don't have answers. They're clutching for straws, and that's why we're here. And obviously my client's not guilty.
Right. Do you remember the runaway bride, a case in Georgia where there was no trial, but she disappeared and everybody thought something had happened and she'd been killed, and turns out she'd just taken off without a word. So, Andell, thank you for your amazing insight as always. We are going to go to a break, but please stay with Law and Crime and return to trial with us. That was fun to see the cross-examination versus the direct examination. Now, Andell, I'd like to bring you back in as our analyst and expert. I think that she acted like she was annoyed and aggravated and a little perturbed with the questions posed by the defense. What's your opinion?
I agree with your assessment, and I don't think it helps witnesses. But at the same time, I don't.
All right, so we've lost sound, and I apologize for that until we can get the sound back. I think part of the point that was going to be made is, you know, it is a tough job to be a trial attorney and a defense attorney and ask questions in a way that you don't invoke the emotions of the witness to actually get annoyed, because if they do, it can really turn off the jury. And I think in this case, again, here's a witness that had nothing to do with this case other than she heard about it on Facebook. She heard the address. She ended up doing a Google search. She found out it happened right down the street. So she did the right thing, which was she contacted law enforcement and she offered to share all of their surveillance videos from that day, the day before, the day after. And so, you know, you can probably assume or guess maybe she didn't want to have to come testify in a court of law and have people ask her questions in front of a bunch of other people. But that's what happened in this particular case. So we're going to take a break now and then join us back in trial. Andell, let's see if you've joined us. Are you able to hear us and back on?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. So, Andell, we have back with us. Any other comments on that?
On the testimony, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Obviously, it's tough as a defense attorney to lay out your case and ask all the important questions. But at the same time, I think jurors want to see that witnesses are interested in telling the truth. They're not favoring one side or the other. They're not treating the direct examination different from the cross-examination. And that's what they're looking for.
So we are going to be signing off for the day. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us on Law and Crime, and it may be time for the end of the day for your host. Thanks so much.